Morning, Dr. Michael Fisher, here to do a serious political, philosophical, cultural, psychological, anthropological, educational, and generally architectural talk about how we can re-architect our society, ourselves, our culture. Particularly, I will focus on a cultural therapia today, a term I've used before, often with cultural psychiatry, cultural psychiatric treatment of how do you put culture on the couch. All of those are part of helping us to look at ways that we can resource ourselves, make ourselves more resilient to not just personal coping, because there's no use personal coping within a culture or society that is actually dying. And you're adjusting to and coping to and with something that actually is dying and is unsustainable. Something that ecological people have in the eco crisis and the polycrisis down today have been reminding us over and over, critics from all walks and camps, um, except some camps that don't buy that there's an ecological polycrisis, that we have to remake, re-architect, as I said in earlier, a whole entire way of being in life. And there's no simple solution. There's no just human potential or new age or esoteric or spiritual religious salvation here. As far as I can see, all of my studies in the last 50, 60 years of a conscious awareness life, that what we have and been given is a great gift from our society, from nature, and it's all now in peril. And we know the future is shrinking terribly at an enormous rate for future generations. So if you are someone older like me, well, we're kind of lucky we've had a chance to live here for 7 decades or so. And the young people coming up are looking at a future where they've only lived here a couple decades, and they're looking ahead at what kind of life am I going to have to live. And so coping with all of that, changing of an actual future imaginary is very difficult and challenging and ontologically destabilizing, greatly secure for many. And there's no doubt that why mental health problems are massively going up, especially for young people in those early couple decades. So all of that put together, I can tell you the old people aren't doing so well either, mental health wise, but we tend to have a lot more coping skills to buffer ourselves. We may have pocket money and capital, housing, etc., and many of us don't. So the point being today, why would you listen to me? Um, you don't have to, and certainly I don't even care if you agree with me or not. What I'm searching for is a conversation that will be helpful to a lot of people. So pass this around if you think it's an important topic. And I'm going to drill down and get, a bit theoretical academic at times for sure. So watch this and more than once. Don't expect to get some kind of huge bullet point presentation here that you can just be all excited and inspired by. This is work, so it's also playful, and I can be playful as well as serious work. I'll tell a few stories, but I'm going to focus particularly on a particular theorist, thinker, and pragmatic, very practical woman who is doing amazing work and is now Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria here in Canada. Probably the most progressive, advanced, de-modernizing, decolonizing, really radical thinker and a very sensitive person and leader, powerful leader, right in a dean of education. This is unheard of, as far as I know, across deans of education anywhere in the world. And to have one in Canada, right in Victoria, which is an hour and a half south of me, drive, I feel particularly important now to celebrate this person named Dr. Vanessa de Oliveira, also now De Oliveira, and she's got married and uses the name Andreotti. So you'll see that in the text below, how to spell it, how to look up her work, and a book called Hospicing Modernity. I'll get to that in a minute because there's some other books, trio that I want to show. Let's start with that before I jump into how are we going to put culture today on the chopping block, but really on the couch so that we're compassionate in the hospicing of the dying and the deadness of what has happened to modernity, modernism, since at least the 17th century. Yeah, European history, but of course it's spread. Modernity, modernism has spread across. So it's like a discourse, it's a philosophical, political, ideological, imaginary of how it is to be good, to be true, to be beautiful, to be successful and have progress for humans and humanity. And all of a sudden now we're being confronted with this polycrisis of it collapsing. So modernism is collapsing is another way to look at the title of today's talk. So let me go through the resources, and I'm going to build a set of resources. I'm going to read from Andreotti's book, particularly, and share a few stories that are really good teaching stories and how we have to revise our understanding of what coping even means. Radically revise what coping means. So, yeah, you're going to be interested in coping techniques and things, and I can talk about that. I will. We're also going to talk about how coping is not the same as healing, and we're going to talk about coping has to itself remake itself, redesign, re-architect itself. Okay, so that's again just a reminder of what we're doing here today. Hang in with me. Again, take breaks, watch this video in more than one session. I highly recommend it as part of just a good learning, integrated learning for yourself, rather than the quick fix, quick get, quick go, quick delete, and move on to another video. So I think you get the sense. If you're ready and up for this, let's proceed with three resources that most people I know will not put together as a really potent trio for liberation, or what you can just call emancipation, or what you can call for a cultural therapia in a really deep, holistic, integrated way. I'm going to start with, in my master's PhD work, graduate school at University of British Columbia from 1998 to 2003. I had 5 years to completely sink myself into graduate studies. And so I'm coming in 1998. So I'm like, getting to be what, 45, 46 years old. And I'm sinking in to do a doctorate degree after multiple careers that I've had, multiple powerful experiences in conscious community, my own healing journey, and I'm entering grad school here on the west coast of Canada. Probably a fairly normal mainstream university with a little bit of edge. Certainly, David Suzuki was at UBC during my time as well, and or just prior to. And so there's some radical edges at University of British Columbia, but not that much. But I came for various reasons to that university, and I started going through the library for basically 5 years in a row, almost, daily, and for many, many hours, taking notes, reading across all the disciplines I could. What am I doing? Well, at that age, 46 years old, I'm seriously looking at all the things that have failed for me, all the follies, all the things I've learned, and I'm going, what can I do now to get a doctorate degree in education, curriculum, and design and pedagogy, and come out with something useful to bring into the world? So this is 2003, and I, of course, would take this PhD through post 9/11, which would be another real big awakening for how our culture, I'm talking in a real general way, needs to go on the couch. First book, Comes out of the 1990s, and it's Shella Sandoval. And all of the three books I'm going to show, this one here is called, you know, Methodology of the Oppressed. You may have heard of Paulo Freire's Education for the Oppressed, Pedagogy for the Oppressed is his famous book. Comes out of Brazil, Latin America, South America. All these three books are I'm focusing on as a triad of Southern global critical thinkers. And that means Latina, Latinx, and definitely Puerto Rican. And this one is particularly a Latina scholar, feminist, and really brilliant analysis of where methodologies are going. So, methodology of the oppressed. Won't go into any details about that, but most people do not know of this person's work, and that's a great, great loss because it's quite brilliant what they have put together. And I see Angela Davis does the intro to it, the famous Angela Davis, Black pedagogue, feminist from those times of the Black Panthers, etc. So, so we've got Shella Sandoval's book, and then the next one comes about, maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s. I found Consciousness in Action, and it's toward an integral psychology of liberation and transformation. And is a very important word in my philosophy, psychology, politics, thinking. I am an integralist. Eventually have adopted that. Comes from another tradition of integral theory, integral philosophy. Won't go into that. I've done videos on that. If you want to check out my work, and I've written lots about it, ask me more about it if you want to. And it's Raul, authors Raul, Quinones, Rosado. Sorry for the pronunciations, probably not the greatest, but Puerto Rican. And that's, of course, they live in the colony that's colonized by the United States for a long time. And again, what I would call a global South critique of the North. And wonderful book, amazing understanding of the importance of how psychology and politics play together in this coping, healing, liberating complex. And again, these are books that they have a lot of depth of philosophy and psychology and theory. They also have practical ways and processes and models for a good praxis, right? How you bring theory and practice together. So they're highly integrated thinkers. These are people that work in frontline work as well. Again, people of color, people of that global South who have a critique of the global North where I live, and most, white theorist thinkers come out of the European tradition, Eurocentric tradition of thinking and thought. And the global South really disrupts. They are not totally thinking that the North is so advanced. The North thinks the South is not, right? They're the developing nations, countries, the lesser. And so we got this huge North-South divide, as well as an East-West divide, which most of us are more familiar with in East-West thinking. But North-South thinking is the new move, the new turn that is so required that we do serious analysis of what the South has to speak to the North. Because the North has been dominating. Oh my gosh, that word dominating, I'm such a euphemism. It's huge how it's attempted the North, the invaders from the North, and us who have called and established ourselves as, the kingdoms, the empires, the way that we should be modern people. Yeah, that's what the North does. And then they say, well, the rest of the world should be like us too. And that justifies to be colonizers and colonizing. So it's not just about nations of what country, went out, and whether it's the Spanish or the British Empire or, some other empire from the north that went out and captivated and got slaves and built their domains, their kingdoms, really, their materials and cultures that they captured and then used their religions, etc., to ideologies to change and transform people to their way so that they could bring them into their capitalism, their construction of Protestantism or Catholicism or whatever the colonizing mentality was and all of its value systems that they imposed. And then they tried to destroy systematically through genocidal forms of one kind or another oppression to destroy other cultures. So the question is, like, if you're part of the North culture like I am, that's who I'm really speaking the video to today. But I hope also people from the South who identify that way will find something useful in this talk today as well. Let me bring the third part of the trilogy of books. The most recent came out in 2020, Hospicing Modernity, and this is by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, as I said, now de Oliveira. Um, Andreotti is her name. This doctorate, the dean of the education faculty at Victoria, is her latest job. She was also at UBC for a long time and was establishing a collective there, and her PhD research on how do we hospice modernity, hospicing meaning, as you probably maybe have heard or know that word, when someone is in the dying process, they are past the point of they're not going to return, right? They are not going to recover. They are in a medical crisis and or just aging crisis, if you will, process. Not all bad. And they're dying. They are decaying. They are moving into a collapse of their entire system to an end virtually within a particular materialist worldview. They are ending, will be gone forever. So she's saying is that we're facing humanity's wrongs in this book. She's going to face them, all that she learned in her research and her traveling around a lot of the global South, not only the South, also did East-West work. Has an amazing long experience, even for a very young person. And she comes out of the Peruvian tradition herself, but was not raised indigenous, but married an indigenous person from what I can tell is the global South. And yes, lived in America, yes, but also recovered her roots and went back and did the research, the thinking, the global work in, quote, development and hospicing. What she realized is that, as many critics have, that modernity, modernism, is dying, and it actually is dead, but hasn't admitted it's dead. And that's the worst kind of historical relative you want to have, is someone who has died, but won't admit they're died. So for other purposes, we can just say it's dying and doesn't like to admit it. It wants to still be supreme, northern, dominant, superior, and it's very white, which she calls whiteness. So you cannot help but look at racism, classism, and it moves into all the other kinds of social activism, as she says, facing humanity's wrongs and the implications for social action today. And this really is not just about social activism, even though it's a great handbook, theoretical and practical, for activists, educators, leaders. It's really for everybody who wants to figure out how to cope with a society that's dead, and dying, but it's really dead. It's really gone. It's really lost its ideal. It's lost its building of how it had an architecture to survive. She has a good picture in here. See if I can find it. I think she calls it the box. It's a representative of the kind of mindset, that controls modernity and modernism. The whole philosophy, the theory, the language, the values, the beliefs, and not finding it right in the moment. It's not that important because there's many things I will bring out from here, but she's just really talking about we really have to examine the inside of the house of modernity. And she'll have cute little diagrams, and I see one here. You can look at the three houses of modernity, but she breaks them down into three sections. It's harnessed fears, it's scarcity mentality, it's compensatory desires to try to hide those fears, which she calls under accumulation, and then the perceived entitlements of that house of modernity is ownership. So you're living in that house, she says. If you're a modern person living today, this is the house that you have to examine. You have to re-look at how your house is broken, it's falling apart, and it's unfixable because it's dead. The ideals are so bad, they're so wrong, as she says, that you will try to use those same wrong principles, fears, desires, entitlements, to constantly reconstruct that which is actually falling apart and which you, at some level, know it is not working. The modern way of life. And this goes across. This is why I'm introducing this. This is not just coping better and feeling activist and feeling good about yourself because you're going to be a libertarian, you're going to be a right wing, you're going to be a left wing, you're going to be a centrist politically. Or you're just going to say, I don't want to be involved with politics. I'm just going to do my ways of healing or coping or liberation, and I don't want to join any political camp. And she's not writing about which camp you should belong to as a political, psychological orientation to making meaning of your life and offering something to your children, to future generations, whatever your legacy is that you want to build in this world. Just even with your own children, if you have children, your adult parent. She's saying that those very tools of which we will try to fix the broken house of modernity will be the very things that get in the way of actually changing it to something that can be lived. And that's why she's saying we have to help the house collapse and die. And we're going to have a whole bunch of parts of ourselves. And she goes into this depth and fine detail. She's very well aware and has done the experiential end of this work. Guides us through how to deconstruct, decolonize, de-modernize ourselves, our group think, our society think, our cultural think, couch. And we have to revise our own therapies, all the therapies that are modern therapies. That's huge. But the work's there. I think we've got it. You can take any of these three books, you can just take one. I'm focusing on this one today. to basically say, yeah, the fourth image of the house cracking below a water-damaged roof, collapsing under the weight of social, ecological, economic, political, informational, and existential crises. This includes global pandemics, climate crisis, unsustainable growth, overconsumption, a surplus labor force, mass migration, economic precarity and instability, political polarization, social fragmentation, mental health crises, violent conflict, wars, democratic election of populist authoritarian governments, and the cancellation of welfare and rights. This house frames and invites questions. Should we fix the house? Expand it? Build another house? Learn to live without a house? Create other types of shelters? Question mark. Those who live inside the houses are deeply conditioned by its structure intellectually, affectively, and relationally. For example, the house creates affective and relational feedback loops that are mostly unconscious, as she shows in this diagram, the different elements. Certain fears that are at the base, she calls of scarcity, of uncertainty, worthlessness, shame, are harnessed and recast as compensatory desires, example for accumulation, certainty, superiority, purity, which in turn become perceived entitlements inside the house, example, to own property, to have stability and security, immunity to crises and poverty, and innocence. These are deadly reinforcing ideas, she argues, of modernity's structure, its architecture. We'll keep telling you that's the norm. That's not just the norm, that is the best way to progress. So all of progress under this critique, this hospicing of modernity is being, not just now, has been for probably 100 years or more by many different critics, being deconstructed. And you're going to have to decide if you want to keep fixing the modern house with modern tools, or you will basically come to see this modern house home idea and your entitlement to what you think is home in a modern world and a modern dress and identity that you carry as status. You get your carrots feeding you, you get people liking you. These feedback loops of fears, desires, and perceived entitlements keep people deeply attached to and dependent on the house. And that's dependent on the modern enterprise, which is a modern empire, basically. I don't think she uses that precise wording, but I would. How are you going to get yourself out of the empire? And she basically says it's impossible, virtually. And she's got a great chapter, like all her chapters. It's really, I'm critical of lots of things, and I'll bring up some critiques at the end. Chapter 5, surrendering arrogance. One of the biggest tasks of this modernist deconstruction and the requirement of, if we are going to be compassionate in hospicing its death, which is our death, it's mine. It's scary. I don't want to go there. I don't want to die. Nobody does, usually. Yet our way of living is suicidal. It's already dead and dying, the modern ideal. It's gone. Forget about it. Well, then she's basically saying you can't just do that. You can't just talk that way and then think you're outside of modernity because you're postmodern or you're postmodern or you're just cool alternative and you don't believe and live in the modern world and you've developed your own cool alternative, or you've turned back to some religious belief system. And she does have a religious belief system underneath a lot of this book. She is indigenous based, And as I said, she married an indigenous traditional male partner and has constructed a lot of reconstructed her Puerto Rican roots and her roots back to, it's called the Quechua tradition out of Peru, so ancient Mesopotamian spirituality. Fine. But she's very much a modernist, and she admits it. She's modern educated. She's modern lived in the urban centers. She too is talking in here stories of her own deconstruction. Often arrogance, as I read here, is thought to be a trait that some people have and some don't. That's what a psychologist might say. That's what a psychiatrist would say. However, arrogance is also a non-exclusive trademark of modernity. This means arrogance is imprinted in all of us who have been socialized within modernity, and it can be interpreted as a cultural and systemic trait. Arrogance is an attitude of superiority based on an exaggerated sense of importance that demands audience and validation constantly. It often manifests in combinations with presumptuous claims about the superiority of one's knowledge, status, power, or virtues. Arrogance takes root inside us unconsciously as we are conditioned by modernity's hierarchies of worth, of knowledges, cultural institutions, persons, and other beings, and how much money you have in your bank account. I won't read any more from her book, but I want to go through a story now that she introduces. I particularly liked it because it was for her a turn recently. I mean, she turned to a philosophical inquiry in children's literature was part of it. Sounds like her dissertation work. And I'm only recently exploring her work, so don't come to me for being an expert on her work. I can interpret it just from the scanning of the book so far, and I haven't even read the whole book. It's a story that came when she was at UBC, hired as dean finally in this job. She's going to try it. I can't believe a dean in a faculty of education in Canada or anywhere is understanding the human crisis, polycrisis, like she does, and is actually a dean and is promoting, obviously, this notion of hospicing modernity into her faculty of education there. I mean, I really want to have conversations with faculty and students at that university. No, it's very recent. I think she was hired 2 years ago. I've written to her several times. She's not responded, unfortunately. I wanted to have conversations. I would drive down there and meet her in a second, just like, let's talk. I have a lot of interests like yours, and then I have some critiques and how we could possibly improve this and bring it into curriculum and reconsider the whole death of education, which I have long separated and divorced myself from the very field that I have a PhD in education. I had to because I saw it was so dysfunctional. It was so dead. It was so dying and would not admit it still thinks education is progress and it believes all these modernist ideals. Of course, not everybody in education does. Some of the rarer critics and marginalized voices do not think education is so wonderful and modernism is not so wonderful, etc. Right? And particularly the indigenous perspective, which is a decolonizing, de-modernizing worldview, is the one she holds deeply herself, but she's not just holding that worldview, that perspective. She's bringing other critiques from other domains, as do I. So she comes out of her university office. This is in her fairly early days, obviously, at that university. She talks about going to a meeting. So here she is heading off around noon, goes to this meeting, and on her way outside the door of her faculty office, she discovers a branch looks like it'd blown off a tree or something, and it's, you know, on the sidewalk on campus. And there's a hummingbird hanging upside down, clinging with its claws to the branch, but upside down, hanging underneath the branch. Branch was obviously bent in some kind of U shape. The bird's not touching the ground, but it's just hanging there, kind of like we'd see a bat hanging from a cliff surface, cave. And this hummingbird was completely dead. She was not moving. She poked it. She couldn't help but notice this amazing sight before her, this incredible jewel of a great, beautiful design of life that is now lifeless, that is dead. Or was it dying? See, she's got the question mark. And she couldn't just bypass it. She says, people are going to step on this. I could move the branch, but I don't want to leave this bird. It's too beautiful. It's too gorgeous. I don't want to leave it. I don't want to unattend its death, even if it is dead. And it appeared to be so. These are some of the values that she has as, again, an indigenous worldview, but also just a good naturalist, nature, and you could say humanitarian point of view. She cares. A moral point of view. She cares about the other. What value is it? No, there's no value in the modernist economic world of her job, her career, of that university. She's not going to get credit for it. Stopping her busyness, her meetingness to go to all these meetings. You can imagine a dean. She does. She stops. She eventually takes the bird off the branch, wraps it in her scarf a little bit, puts it in her purse, and goes to the meeting and says, in her mind, I'll call my husband later. He has understandings of how to do ceremony with dead and dying creatures and others. And so she says, I'll call on his advice and we'll do something with it later. I'll get him to come down to the university. So she heads off to the meeting. And then after the meeting, comes out, takes a peek, and remembers, oh, wow, yeah, I've still got to deal with this. I better phone my husband. So she calls him. He's coming on the way. But in the meantime, as she's walking outside and sort of looking at her scarf, she's seeing it moving its legs, vibrating a little bit. And she goes, oh my gosh, it's not Dad. Or maybe I can do something to save it, right? The rescue operation and all those parts of caring to helping to rescue, bringing her compassion to this little being that she doesn't have to be compassionate with at all. And from that deep commitment she has, she carries the bird in her hand now, thinking maybe the warmth of her hand will also be useful. Maybe, and it's the bird's starting to make more movements. It's just flattering its wings a bit. And then within a few minutes, she's talking about going down the sidewalk. And the students are coming out of class in mass loads, as they do at a certain time if you're on campuses, when they end the class and everybody pours out to go to the next class, the period. And she's walking down the sidewalk. Students are massively coming by her. She's going upstream, she said. And this little hummingbird is actually flying and flapping above, just above the scarf in her hand. It's like fluttering. And then it would sort of tire out and fall back down to the scarf and lay there a bit. And then it'd try to flutter again, but it was just staying really close, right? Like just hanging in a few inches above her hand, scarf. And she noticed as she's going through the people, this bird is still fluttering and flying above her hand. And she says, I don't see one set of eyes of our new students in this elite institution of education, modern education. I don't see one student look at me and what's going on, looking at this bird. How could you not see this? And she says, they don't see it. They may have seen it, but they don't register it because they're registering all of their movements in the modern education system, the school bus, the schooling of what's important, what's valuable, what's going to give them entitlement, what's going to give them their security, what's going to give them their likes by their peers, by their academics, by their parents. All their worries, concerns, attention, distracted, never mind the phones of all their social media and other things. And she said that really hit her, that this is what modern education does. Then she tells a story of, by the way, the bird did survive and flew off. She talks about the teaching of the hummingbird, and there's another teaching of the hummingbird I won't go into, but read the book if you wish. And then she talks about just a similar analogy during her PhD research of philosophical inquiry into children and how children can think philosophically, which I find a fascinating topic, and I've done videos on that myself. And she says one of the things she noticed when she would take a children's book, use it as a tool to do investigations, ask questions, engage children. She did the research in Nepal at a particular couple places, but Nepal was in one where she worked with classrooms, brought in these particular books she had chosen. She thought they were good teaching books. And she then would ask, questions after the reading or during the reading of the book. And she just said, in general, what she learned over her PhD research was that children in the 4 to 5 category, before they learn to read and write in full English vocabulary and meaning structures and categorizations and naming of reading and learning to read and write, that 4 to 5 year olds were amazing in their ways they could dance with stories. I'm quoting her. And once children got to learn to read and write, so we're now looking at 6, 7, 8s, which she worked with as well, with the same books, and how they responded to her questions and the questions they came up with. She said they were much more predictable, boring, and could not dance well with the story. They were more categorizing and impacting and influencing the way to make sense of the story, whereas the younger, pre-literate almost children were much more alive, creative. And this is what we know about what happens to creativity through education. It declines and declines and declines. And she said that's, again, modern education and the emphasis on the mind, the intellect, these categories and the power of words. And we've lost, many things, the tradition of the sacred, the understanding that everything is a teacher. And the hummingbird lesson, she asks, how is the hummingbird a teacher for me in that encounter? How is the encounter with the wind today, or a particular day, or an encounter with an individual of a species, human and or greater than human? And all of a sudden you start to realize what modernity has done to us and she calls it an existential poverty. We've created an existential poverty, our existence, which is more potent and more foundational than our humanness. See, our humanness is up here, but our existence, our beingness as existence, is a huge foundation that connects us to all beings and all existences. If you really take that in, and I ask you to meditate that, contemplate it, write it, think it, sing it, dance it, you will really get a sense of existence is our foundation. Then we construct humanity on top of that. And that's what humanism, through modernism, and those philosophies and ways of understanding and ideals and values and beliefs have constructed. So you see, this is way beyond political positioning and my politically correct identities that I wish to be known by. Very specific identities. She argues those are not necessarily helpful to your existence and expanding your existential poverty in a good way, not a grasping, extracting, exchange economy kind of way, but through this giftingness that sits within existences. The fact you exist is the gift. And so you develop a very different gratitude practice. And this is again not about humanity. It's connected to humanity, but it's more foundation. And that's what I'm tweezing out and pulling further upon her idea of existential poverty. But it's really good to sit with and work with and say, well, what can I do today? So let's end the video with what can you do today? And not just you as an individual, but you and all your relations to many existences of beings, beingness, human and more than human, not just your society, your culture. But you can see modern culture is a culture of fear. It's a culture of this entitlement she speaks of. It's a culture of shortage, always attempting to get higher, very phallic rather than matrixial. I won't go on and on with that critique other than to say, how can you better cope with it? And I would say the first thing you want to do is say all and look at how you actually cope. So look at your methodologies, your consciousness around coping itself and how you've constructed and others have taught you to construct ways to cope. And arguably in a modern society, culture in general, so I'm generalizing about culture, not breaking it down into very specific cultures. You can add that analysis as you will, but I'm talking in a very generic way. She is an historical consciousness of modernity, modern culture consciousness, that you have to become critical and self-reflective upon your very ways of coping. And ones that you've mastered, and ones that you find make you feel better. Calm, peaceful, even. This is the work you can do, is to really, if you really are part of this awareness and awakening of a transformation, be honest with yourself, she says, and really surrender to your arrogance of how you bought into this modern arrogance. Is that depressing? Yeah, death and dying is not exactly, exciting. Is it depressing? Yeah, kind of is. Does it have to be? No, it doesn't. That's why we're now in a society where death doulas are not just birth doulas, are appearing quite regularly in books and books and people going into these professions to help us die. Where a lot of us are getting old, but she's saying this is also a metaphor, and I agree, a metaphor for what's happening to our entire culture, modern culture. We have to death doula it. We have to birth through our death and dying in this way of being that is unsustainable. And it is not just unsustainable, it is systematically erasing the future of generations of many beings' existences and our children and the children of other children and their children and other species, polluting our nest. So again, that's all seems depressing. So I've heard a couple people recently that I know, respect, say things that I find quite disturbing in terms of how they have come to their life as adults, matured, more or less. And they'll say things like, well, I just want to pay attention to things that are working well and not the things that are not working well in the world. So I'm only going to focus all my attention. I could see why you would want to do that, to be positive, to feel good, to not stick your nose in too much attention. I'm the same. I don't want to put too much attention on what's not working well. But it was the either or thinking that is part of modernity itself. That's one of the tools of coping. I'm going to just focus on the positive things that are working well. That tells me the coping mechanisms need to be reconsidered and recalculated, especially under this kind of critique of these three books, and particularly Andreotti's Hospicing Modernity book, and just other arguments I could make about why just do one or the other, why even speak that language of one or the other. This is a very rigid and very defensive, buffered way of being in the world. This is coping that is not that great of coping. Although, who am I to say, right, that you shouldn't use a coping mechanism of this kind or this kind in certain circumstances? I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to criticize everything that you do as coping is inadequate or wrong, but she is going much further and deeper than that, as I would, to collapse the very tools that we use to cope and build ourselves up. And being positive and looking at the positive only, that's a tool of coping of modernity. That's why modernity loves its progress. It loves its looking up. And our greatness and superiority toward that, and our privilege and our arrogance to do so without looking at your privilege is off the backs of those. And this is the north-south divide. The North has succeeded off the backs of enslavement and destruction of the South. Well, I'm taking a South perspective, aren't I? Yeah, that's how I started the video. All of those books, I said they were from the South, the global South critics, the worldview of living, the lived life experience and the history of what the South has had to endure, and amazingly has great gifts to offer the North to correct the North, but it's now spread throughout. So whether you're in the North or the South or the East and the West, as Andreotti says, we all have to do this work of hospicing modernity, which is be compassionate with the coping and the attachments we have to modernity. We're not just going to jump out of it. And so don't get hard and down on yourself because you're a modernist and you're attached to modernist tools and coping mechanisms. So then we go into, well, what is healing? And healing is different than coping. And so I'll just show this card that my partner and I put together of natural healers. You can just scan that. This is just like a beginning 101, we give this out like a business card, and then you can write, as you pass that card out, you can write, a contact so that somebody could do healing with you, not just coping. And so that's just part of this reconstruction, this putting culture on the couch and how we would come out. So let me go into a few of the critiques I have as I start through, and then I'll end here. Again, this book came out in 2021, and made a few notes here. Okay. So I say I don't see so far in my scanning of this book that she deals with generational differences in their attachments and embeddedness to economic, social, political, and stylistic norms of modernity. So I don't see that tweezing out of a young person and an older person and an aged person trying to work through this hospicing of modernity, right? And re-evaluating coping mechanisms. And so that to me is all missing, which is a sensitivity to generational. So that alone, I have a problem with not being a very complete book, but maybe then the book would be so much bigger, of course. I also don't like how she uses the dialectical and puts that in the box of modernity. And I argue dialectical thinking is way beyond how she defines dialectical in a very narrow way. She uses a very European-centric, Platonic, and or a kind of Hegelian dialectic is what she really focuses on, and that's not dialectical thinking. He's just one expression. Hegel, the philosopher, Western European philosopher of this, modernity, early modernity. So she to me conflates that, and dialectical thinking is extremely important in working with the either or, both and in with thinking, and the transformation of reasoning through a dialectical process and dialogical. And then I guess I overall have a critique of the re-enchantment of the world argument, which this book is part of. Her many are in the indigenous worldview, the decolonizing worldview. There's a lot of romantic return, retrogressive to me in some ways, and so she's a bit anti-evolutionary for sure, and anti-hierarchical, and I find very rigid in how she defines those kind of categories for her critique in many. She's in the camp of many post-structuralists, post-modernists, and I definitely am more postmodernist, integralist. So she to me doesn't quite have the integralist framework, and she would argue probably and critique me as being modernist. And I would go, yeah, I think you're retro modernist. So too much for my liking. But that doesn't mean we don't have something to do together, and we can integrate the best of our works and still have good dialogue and work toward a common goal, because we have so many things in common. So I would just say it's a great book on reimagining our lives, your life, the life of your relationship to your children and or children of future generations, whether they're your children or not your children. It's about creating space, new spaces for this new imaginary and this new healing, liberating, emancipatory processes that isn't driven, as she says, by desperate hope or a fear of desolate hopelessness. And I would agree. I think it's a very sensitive book. I wish her the best in all the followers. It's become quite popular. I went to the bookstore here in Nanaimo, and the bookstore owner in the small little bookstore said, "Oh, we're selling a lot of those books here." And I'm like, in Nanaimo, you're selling a lot of those books. I'd like to meet those people. Have you got a list? No. It's just so hard to find people to have these kind of conversations with. I'm glad I can do that on YouTube. I'm glad you're here joining me, listening today. And again, pass this video on if you feel that's important. I better stop this recording and move on to the day, and invite you into hospicing modernism in its worst and what's become over-consuming side of an ideology that is now dead. Let's renew ourselves, but let's not jump to thinking we can renew ourselves by X, Y, Z. That's one of the things she says. That's your arrogance, thinking you can just jump out and get out of modernity and be the cool, alternative, hip, emancipatory, enlightened person. Much more harder work.